In this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can enforce the use of API keys for clients that are using your API. And to do this, we're going to use something called HTTP basic authentication. So the first thing that I should do is explain what that means. So I have the Wikipedia open for basic access authentication, and you'll notice that it's a fairly lengthy description of it, but essentially the core comes down to this. We want the client, in our case Postman that we're testing with, to pass this authorization header, which will consist of the word basic followed by a base64 encoded username and password. So if you're not familiar with base64 encoding, basically it's just a way to convert a string, let's say we have username : password, into a slightly more obfuscated string over here. It's not secure in the sense that you can actually just very, very easily reverse decode something. It's just very simple, but it just provides that little bit extra obfuscation over just a plain text username and password. So, in other words, we want to ensure that a correct username and password is provided to our API, and the format that we are going to expect this information to come into us is in this HTTP basic authentication format. So in Postman, it's actually very easy to do. What we can do is click on this authorization tab, and you'll notice that there's this option for basic auth. If I click on that, it's going to allow us to specify a username and password. So right now, because we haven't set up our API to authenticate anything, if I go ahead and just pass nothing, we see that we get a list of users returned back to us. So how do we block access to our API and enforce the client to pass us a valid API key? Let me show you how. To do this, we can go into our trusted setup controller, and Restify actually has something that we can use to parse the incoming authorization header. And to do that, we just say restify.authorization parser. So we're going to use the authorization parser that comes with Restify. And we're also going to use, I'll do a little trick here where we're going to use an anonymous function which takes our standard request, response, and next. Let me just quickly complete the function definition. So this is saying use, and then we're defining our own anonymous function. And in here we can put whatever we want. So I'm going to define a variable called API keys to store our valid API keys. And let's say we have a user called user1, and his API key is just going to be, I'll just insert a bunch of gibberish here, just a bunch of letters and numbers. So here's what I'll consider to be a valid API key for user1. In order to enforce that this API key is passed, what we can do is the following. First of all, let me define a response for when a valid API key is not passed to us. We'll use our standard format and say that the status is going to be failure. And in this case, I'll just say that the data is going to be, you must specify a valid API key. And I'm going to go ahead and borrow from our helper functions this code here, which is responsible for actually sending the response. Go into our setup controller, and this code is actually responsible for sending our response. We'll use status code 403, which means forbidden, in case that they do not pass a valid API key. And then what we need to check, and here's where the magic happens, we'll wrap this entire thing in an if statement, and we are just going to say if type of request.authorization.basic is undefined. That means an authorization header was not passed in. Or if the username is not in our API keys array, and we can check the API keys array for rec.authorization.basic.username. So this will automatically be available to us via this restify authorization parser. It's going to put the username into this rec.authorization.basic.username field. Or I'll check one last condition. I'll say if the password does not match. So this is going to say if rec.authorization.basic.password is not equal to what we have stored in our API key for this particular user. If any one of those conditions are true, then that means that we should return a a failure response because the correct API key was not passed. Otherwise, I'll just say return next, using this next because we're within our anonymous callback function, and that'll just tell us to go to the next part of the execution. And let's go ahead and try this out in Postman. So if I head to Postman and do not pass a valid API key, now we're getting this failure must specify a valid API key. And because I've included this basic auth, you'll notice that it adds this extra field for us where the key is authorization and the value is this basic followed by the base 64 encoded version of our username password, which we did not pass. So in order to actually pass a username and password, our username was user1 and our password I'll just copy and paste. So if I enter in user1 and I'll enter in a slightly wrong password by changing this 9 to an 8, we see that we get you must specify a valid API key. Same thing if we choose an invalid user. But if I change it back to user1 and change the 8 back to a 9, there we go. We see that we get our full list of users. So this is a very simple way that you can enforce basic authentication and API keys for your API. So as you can see, it didn't take that much code, and we're just leveraging the restify authorization parser to do most of the work for us. Okay, that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next lesson.